Welcome everyone, they call me IntroTechOut and I really appreciate the support in my last video. You wanted more, so I'll give you more. This video will be a bit different though, because this time I will go into the gameplay side of things instead of the more artistic side like last video. The topic? First-person characters. Even though I think Dreams is quite synonymous with third-person platformers in most people's heads, first-person games might be the best starting point if you are new to Dreams and immediately want to create fun, gameplay-oriented levels. That's why this video I wanted to completely analyze literally every bit of logic in the first-person puppet template from Media Molecule. Coincidentally, while working on this video, Media Molecule actually released an update to Dreams, where now a complete level exists that shows you how you can use the first-person character. But this video will go a lot more in-depth, so I don't really mind. Anyway, this video will hopefully give you an idea of how to change certain attributes of the puppet, what to tinker with, and what to definitely leave alone if you don't want your level to crash and burn. And maybe by the end of it you will feel inspired to create your own first-person game. But I want to make clear here that this is not necessarily a tips and tricks video, even though I will still give out some. It was originally, but just explaining the logic in the puppet alone already proved difficult enough. So, this video will just be me trying to explain what the inner workings of this first-person puppet are, so you don't have to spend hours reverse engineering logic like I did. My next video will probably be about first-person tips and tricks though, like how you can create interactions with the environment, two-handed weapons and a whole lot more, so keep an eye out for that if you're interested, I guess. As for this video, I've left some timestamps in the description for those who are running into a specific problem and want to know if this video covers it. But let's begin. Like I said earlier, I think first-person levels are a great starting point for beginners. I've got two reasons for this. First of all, the FPS template from Media Molecule controls incredibly well. When I first used this character, I was almost shocked at the responsiveness of the puppet. It controls so great that honestly, it would fit right into an actual first-person game like Dishonored or Doom. So whoever made this, props to you, because this makes everything so much easier for us. The second reason why I think first person is a good starting point is because you won't actually have to create a character. Sculpting is one of those harder things to do in Dreams, and the sculpting of characters even more so. This may give a lot of pressure to new players who don't want to use pre-existing characters from the community because they don't necessarily fit their scene, but they also don't have the ability to create characters that are good enough to not ruin immersion. And I am part of this group as well. Luckily, Media Molecule can help us out with the first-person puppet template character thingy. So if you don't want to bother with the character creation, just make the whole thing invisible and you're done. Why? Well, because also luckily, a lot of real game developers are lazy as well, so most players are already accustomed to not being able to see their legs in-game. Great. But here's the thing. The first-person puppet is not an integral part of the game. It's literally just a normal puppet with logic all over it. I will show some of it, but I need to warn you, the following scenes are not for the faint of heart. The first logic board is relatively tame, with only a couple of components on it. But then comes the second one, which is a logic board with 10 independent microchips on it, all filled with logic and sometimes even more microchips, all of which relate to each other and are tweakable to a frankly absurd amount. But even though all of this is shocking enough, you might later come to the realization that there are even more microchips filled with logic on the puppet's body. Which by the way has 4 arms if you deactivate preview invincibility. This is the point where I'm guessing most would consider uninstalling the game. But not today, because I will try to explain to the best of my ability what all this stuff does. I do not know everything though, as I'm also new to the game, but my prior experience with Little Big Planet does give me a significant edge over players completely new to the logic. So for the intro though, we have a lot, and I mean a lot of logic to get through, so let's begin officially. The first tweakable thing you will come across is the puppet itself. If you go ahead and open the tweak menu on it, all kinds of stuff becomes visible. These settings mostly speak for themselves though. A couple things you might want to do is give the character a double jump, more air control, or you might want to increase or decrease the walking speed, the latter I did with the cyberpunk scene I talked about last video. To make the whole puppet invisible, you can use the visibility toggle in the physical properties tab in the tweak menu. Next we have the first microchip. The first thing I wanted to mention are all the nodes on the logic boards. Nodes just exist so you can organize your logic and make it more accessible to other players. Any signal that goes into the input of one of these is the exact same signal that leaves via the output. With that out of the way, let's examine the 3 switches on the logic board. With these, you can choose the template you want to work with. Activating the switch labeled Weapon Active will make you spawn with a pistol template. This is by the way why the puppet has 4 arms. There are always two arms invisible because there are two templates and they use different arm and hand animations. There is also a switch called Imp Activate, which makes the imp visible when playing. The last switch is called Advanced Projectiles. This one makes the projectiles from the gun behave more like bullets instead of bouncing balls. Next up is the Health Manager. This one is connected to an effects tool, so there are effects on the screen when you lose health, and also to a controller sensor so the player dies at 0 health. More on the controller sensor later. But the other logic on this first logic board is not really stuff you have to bother with, so let's move on to the next microchip. The one labeled Logic Processing. Here's where pretty much all the interesting gameplay related stuff happens. First, let's take a look at the microchip camera controls. Here's where Media Molecule has created the ability for the player to look around in first person. The way they have done this is quite ingenious, which admittedly does make it a bit harder to change things in this framework. How and why will come later though. First, you will notice the output from the right analog stick being pushed through a signal splitter. This piece of logic splits a signal that contains more information than just a value between 0 and 100. In this case, the signal from the analog stick contains information about both the position of the stick in the X and Y axis. This signal is split with a signal splitter so both can get their own pieces of logic attached. For turning the character left and right, a rotator is used. If you want to change the sensitivity in this direction for the scene you're building, you can change the speed in its tweak menu. Do note that the number for speed displays 0 before you move over it with the imp. Also, if you want to increase the speed of rotation, you need to drag the speed slider further to the left, and if you want to decrease the speed of rotation, you need to drag it to the right. When the number becomes positive, the x-axis will respond backwards to the stick's input, essentially making it inverted, which will make no one happy. The y-axis was handled different though, because you can't just turn the whole puppet on its back to make it look up. That's why a custom animation has been made to do the looking without having the feet leaving the ground in awkward ways. This was achieved with a timeline with two keyframes on it, one where the puppet looks down, one where the puppet looks up. By connecting these on the timeline, an animation is created where the puppet will start looking up more and more the further you move to the right on the timeline. There is a tutorial on timelines in Dreams if you want to learn more about this. To control the timeline, a timer was used in a really surprising way. See, the timer with the current settings doesn't count up or down at a consistent speed. It actually responds to how strong the signal is from the right analog stick, and also the direction you are pushing it in. Additionally, the signal that connects to the timeline is not if the timer is done, but the current position of the timer. By connecting this signal to the playhead of the timeline, what is created is essentially a slider that dictates the current position in the animation. The harder you push the analog stick up, the faster the timer moves to the right and the further the playhead moves along the timeline towards the up position. This can be kind of hard to wrap your head around, so all you really need to know is that to change the sensitivity in the y-axis, you need to change the target time and current time on the timer. To make the aiming slower in this direction, make the target time higher. To make the aiming faster, make the target time lower. The current time should preferably always be exactly in the middle of 0 and your target time, or else you will spawn looking down or up. The last thing in this microchip worth discussing is the microchip labeled Reticule UI. This is the aiming reticule Media Molecule chose, and it's just a dot. If you want to remove it, you can either use a toggle to turn the microchip off, or just delete the whole thing altogether. But okay, we're finally done with the camera controls. Up next is the controller logic. This microchip contains all the outputs for the buttons in the form of a controller sensor. This controller sensor is maybe the most important part of the puppet, because this is the gadget that allows the player to possess it. Without the controller sensor, the puppet would just be a lifeless husk. In the tweak menu of the controller sensor, you can find all the buttons of your DualShock 4. By connecting the outputs of these buttons to logic, you can create gameplay. You can attach the output to anything you want, whether that be animations, actions the puppet can perform, emitters, lights, sounds, anything. But a couple of buttons are already in use. You will for example find that X is attached to the jump action of the puppet and R2 is connected to the pistol. Also the left stick is attached to the walk action and the right stick is connected to the earlier mentioned splitter in the camera controls. For scenes that play more like walking simulators, disabling the jump option by deleting that wire might make it easier to make your level foolproof. As an added bonus, it will also make your level slightly more immersive. There are two more things you should be aware of in the controller sensor. First is the important Properties tab in the Tweak menu. Here you can change how possession works. Maybe you want to make a level where you can possess other characters from a distance, for example, in which case you should definitely turn off the Forced Possession option. The last tab of the controller sensor gives you a couple more inputs and outputs as well, of which a couple influence how death works. Something you might notice is that there are already two ways for a character to die. One is for his health to deplete, but the other is for him to fall off the map. The location of the signal is in the puppet interface next to the controller sensor, and this connection is something you might want to delete when creating specific levels. Because currently the character dies and respawns after falling for a second or two. While this constitutes to falling off the map in most situations, in some it just doesn't. I'm currently working on this silly level where you have to walk up a ramp while getting objects thrown at you, but I noticed that my character would respawn if I jumped backwards, just because the ramp is so steep and the jump height is so great. On top of that, I also wanted players to not immediately die after falling off the ramp. I wanted it to feel a bit more dramatic, by letting you helplessly fall down until you reach the clouds below. Deleting the death after falling off the map action was crucial here to make the level more fun. Keep in mind though that if you do this, the player can now fall endlessly further down, which means you'll have to make a big invisible platform somewhere beneath the level that kills the player instantly. You can do this by giving the platform a label and then connecting an impact sensor searching for that label to the death action in the controller sensor. The last bits of logic not yet discussed in the controller logic microchip are the calculator and signal manipulator. What the calculator with these current settings does is compare the input value with a preset value. In this case, the calculator will output a signal when the signal on the input is larger than 50. What is this connected to? The trigger, R2. As you know, the triggers are not just on-off buttons like the bumpers. You can press them lightly or push them all the way in. In Dreams, not touching a trigger is given the value 0, and pressing it all the way is given the value 100. By comparing the value with another, what essentially is created is a trigger dead zone. The game will only start responding to your input once the trigger has traveled a certain distance. 50 is exactly in the middle, so the gun shoots once R2 is 50% pressed. Halfway. Connected to the calculator is a signal manipulator. This one makes sure that only a pulse is sent to the gun once you press R2. This prevents the gun from shooting more than one projectile if you keep the trigger held down. Time for the next microchip. This time the display controls microchip. Here's where you can find the text displayers that display the controls that you see when playing as the puppet. I'm a big proponent for letting players figure out themselves how the game works, so I recommend deleting these as they're really obvious. You can always add your own text to the UI though. This can be used for quests, for example. I believe that anyone can figure out how text displayers work, so I won't dwell on these much longer. But there's one thing that most players probably won't figure out, and that's symbols. You can for example see that Media Molecule used two joystick icons, an icon for R2 and one for the X button. I myself was looking for an icon for the Cyberpunk level to show with which objects you can interact, and it drove me crazy that I couldn't seem to find out how to do this. As always, the answers are on the internet. If you go to the website indreams.me and then navigate to User Guide and then Dreams Icons, you will find a full and surprisingly long list of all the icons in the game, and how you can put these in your text displayers. Basically, there's a text command for every icon, and typing the command will make an icon appear in that place. Enough of that though. Next microchip, the one that is called Weapon Activate and Invisible. Honestly, this microchip is just Media Molecule showing off. It contains an animation for pulling your weapon and putting it away, which is completely unnecessary, but still appreciated of course. I also think it has something to do with the visibility of the arms, but I haven't figured this out yet. If you have, comments are appreciated. But let's quickly forget about that microchip. Up next, the Shoot Recoil animation microchip, which is pretty self-explanatory. It contains a recoil animation, which is paired with a screen shaker and a controller rumble for full effect. The next microchip is also pretty self-explanatory, because this one is called Jump Animation. Instead of a timeline though, an animation is created using a Puppet's interface gadget. You might remember this one from the controller logic, where a Puppet's interface was used to make the player die after falling off the map. I may have glossed over the Puppet interface a bit there, but it's really useful, because it allows you to attach logic to certain actions the player performs. There are for example outputs for jump ascend, jump peak and jump descend, allowing you to quickly attach keyframes to all positions. This is how the current jump animation was created. You can let your imagination run wild with the Puppet interface though, as there are many options. It's possible to connect the walking speed to the speed of the background music, for example, or to count the amount of steps the puppet takes, which you can link to the frequency with which an enemy gun is fired. The possibilities are truly endless. The next microchip is called hand animations, and it handles things like the puppets gripping the gun and the clenched fist when the puppet runs. One thing though, you might notice that there are no keyframes at all to find in this microchip. This is because all of the animations for the individual hands are handled at separate microchips, located at all of the wrists. If you're making your puppets completely invisible, you obviously don't have to care about any of the animations. But if you don't and you maybe want to create your own hand animations or have the puppets holding an object or something, these hand animations can create a lot of problems. I was working on this Star Wars prototype, for example, where I wanted the ability to use the Force. The problem is that when the puppet holds his hand out in the Force push position, the animation can still be overridden by the hand animations Media Molecule created. In this case, the puppet's hands will close slightly when running, which looks silly. I honestly recommend just starting from scratch and deleting the whole hand animations microchip in this case. Well, we're now finally nearing the end of the logic board. The next microchip we're taking a look at is the sound effects one. Not entirely surprising, but this chip contains all the sound effects this puppet produces. Here you can change the sound effects for shooting, but also the effects for jumping and footsteps and all other actions. Luckily, Media Molecule has named all of these, so I suspect no one will run into issues here. Next up is the timeline present on the logic board. This one just contains one keyframe, which immediately activates after starting play mode. What the keyframe controls is the visibility of the head and neck. Media Molecule made this so you can still edit the head and neck in create mode without turning preview invisibility off. If you delete this, the camera will be in the head sculpture when you start the game, which will create a white blur covering the screen. There will be situations where deleting this timeline is absolutely necessary, but that's something I will cover in next video. The last microchip on the logic board I will talk about for now is the one called Run. I'm ignoring the other remaining microchip because it makes more sense to discuss it later. In the Run microchip, a couple of keyframes can be found. For the two most above ones, I have absolutely no idea what these do, but the lowest one controls the foot IK. I'm not a game developer, so I don't know what inverse kinematics means exactly, but I do know that foot IK is something that makes the feet of characters level with the floor. This is something that you see often in games these days. The feet of game characters are no longer always completely horizontal, but rather level with whatever surface they stand on. What this all means for dreams? Just don't touch this microchip, or weird things will start happening. That's finally all the animation stuff done. The next thing to analyze is the gun logic. Once again, turn preview invisibility off or you might not get a complete view of the whole situation. First, we will open the microchip labeled gun end position. This one is just there to organize everything. In this chip you will find two more. One for the simple projectile, one for the advanced projectile. The simple projectile is, well, simple. It's just an emitter that emits a projectile and it's connected to the right trigger. Press shoot and you shoot. How easy can it be? Opening the tweak menu of the emitter does of course give you a lot of options, like what the object is you want to emit, the speed at which you want to emit it, etc. The advanced projectile microchip is pure insanity in comparison. It took me a while to understand this, but here's what's going on. The advanced projectile has an explosion effect when you hit something, and just for that, two entire microchips have been dedicated. Here's how it works. You can change the emit speed of the projectile with the slider contained in the first microchip. Changing the slider also changes the range of a laser scope via a calculator that divides the emit speed by 30. Why 30? This translates the original speed, which was in meters per second, to the distance that the projectile would travel in one frame if the game ran at 30 FPS or 2 frames if the game ran at 60 FPS. The laser scope, by the way, is a gadget that casts a ray and then checks if it collides with anything. You can imagine it as a laser pointer. It's a thin beam that travels incredibly fast and stops once it hits something. Media Molecule uses 3 outputs from this laser scope for their first-person puppets. First of all, an output that signifies if a collision was detected, and also the position and rotation of the place where the collision was detected. The latter two are combined into one signal, and then all the wires lead us to the next microchip, which is located on the projectile itself. Here we finally find the emitters that emit the explosion effect, which will hopefully finally make clear why Media Molecule went this complicated route with laser scopes and frame rates to create a few simple explosions. So there are 2 ways for an explosion to be triggered. One is if the projectile hits an object. A laser scope is used that searches for collisions within a distance of 0 meters, which means it will detect the exact moment when the microchip clips into another object. Once it detects a collision, an explosion effect is emitted, and the location and rotation outputs are used to orient the explosion the correct way. Once the effect is emitted, the projectile itself gets destroyed and nothing will be left of it. The second way an explosion can be triggered is if the first laser scope, which is located on the gun instead of the projectile, hits something. You remember, it's the one that covers the distance that a projectile travels during the first frame after emission. Once that hits something, an explosion effect is once again emitted and the location and rotation outputs are used to orient the explosion the correct way, after which the projectile is once again deleted. So why was this done, you might still be wondering? Well, I can't know for sure, but I think it has something to do with the game's physics. See, unlike real life, games usually don't check for collisions 100% of the time. From what I understand, objects that collide with stuff check multiple times per second during small instances if something is hitting it. It's basically asking, is something colliding with me? And now? And now? And now? Tons of times per second. This means though that if an object travels really fast, it can completely go through an object if it passes between two of these questions. Anyone familiar with rockets in Little Big Planet will be familiar with this. To elaborate, a rocket when set to 100% power in Little Big Planet was able to achieve such high speeds that you would usually be launched through the walls of your vehicle within a fraction of a second. But what I think MM is doing with this logic is preventing this from happening to the bullet. With the standard settings, the projectile launched from the handgun travels a distance of almost 12 meters within 1/30th of a second, which is coincidentally pretty close to the speed of actual bullets in real life. But if you delete all the logic with the laser scope and shoot at the floor, the projectile will most of the time just pass straight through. Having your bullets go through the enemy without doing any damage 90% of the time doesn't really make for a fun game, so a compromise was made. So because the distance in the first frame after emission is pretty much traveled instantly anyway, for this distance the laser scope is used to create the explosion effect. This means that enemies within these 12 meters from the gun will literally instantly get hit the moment you pull the trigger, instead of waiting for the projectile, which would take a bit more time. A bit more time as in anywhere from 0 to 0.03 seconds. This does leave me with a question though. If the laser scope only covers the distance that the projectile travels during the first frame after emission, which is about 0.03 seconds, what about the second frame or third frame for that matter? If the collision stuff I just talked about earlier is really the problem, why doesn't the projectile pass through enemies if they are 13 meters away instead of 12? I really doubt that the projectile slows down significantly within 0.03 seconds. Maybe the logic takes a frame to activate, or maybe something else is going on, but I'm pretty sure that Media Molecule knows something we don't in this case. If you happen to know though, I'd love to hear it, of course. Also, one more thing, there's actually a little flaw in this whole system, and that is that the initial laser scope doesn't stop searching for impacts until the projectile has hit something. The last piece of logic on this microchip we haven't discussed yet is the rocket rotator. This gadget makes an object rotate in the direction it's moving, which is great for all kinds of projectiles and vehicles. In this case, it was used to make the microchip on the projectile always face the direction of travel. This is important for the hit detection, because if they hadn't done this, the projectile would be able to travel almost completely through the target before a hit was registered in the microchip by the 0-meter laser scope. One of the last things for today's video is the explosion effect itself. I myself haven't created any effects yet, so for tips on that you'll need to do some tutorials or watch other videos. But I can say something about the logic in it, of course. An important thing to take note of is especially the health modifier contained in the timeline in the middle of the effect. This is the thing that will make enemies' health drop once they get hit. Every standard puppet already has a health bar in him, so you can immediately use them as enemies. You probably need to delete the wire connected to the respawn action in the controller sensor though, or enemies will respawn the moment you kill them. Anyway, if you want to change how much damage the pistol does, or what the area of effect is for the explosion, you need to tweak this gadget. This reminds me, if you're not using the advanced projectile, you can find the health modifier in the microchip on the simple projectile. Back to the explosion effect. A thing that's very easy to miss is the invisible sphere above it. This sphere creates the force from impact, so when you hit something, the object will visibly kick back and react to being hit. How this is done? Well, the moment the explosion is emitted, the invisible sphere will immediately shoot towards the place of impact with a speed of 25 meters per second. Then, the moment it detects a collision, the sphere is deleted, but not before sending the object it hit flying. So if you don't want things to move when you hit them, this is the object to delete. But is this video done yet? Certainly not, but we're getting close. Only 2 microchips remaining. The first one is located on the head and is called camera position. In this microchip, the camera is located that you see through when you play. Tweaking the camera will give you options like field of view, for example. If you have 2 first-person characters in your level at some point, for whatever reason, the camera will give you problems. To choose which character to play as or test, you will need to turn off the camera for the puppet you don't want to control, preferably by using a toggle. Additionally, you will also need to turn off force possession in the controller sensor located in the controller logic microchip. Anyway, in the camera position microchip you will also find a trigger zone. This trigger zone checks if objects are clipping with the extended arm to which the gun is connected. This trigger zone outputs a signal when detecting clipping, which is connected to, you guessed it, the only microchip not yet discussed. The one called Stop Gun Clipping Through Wall. This microchip contains a keyframe that makes the arm move up and as a result away from the wall, and a keyframe that deactivates the ability to shoot for the gun. There are also some signal manipulators present in the microchip, but I honestly have a lot of trouble understanding signal manipulators, so I really don't know what they do in this case. My only guess is that they maybe transform the constant signal from the trigger zone to a pulsating signal, so the animation can't easily get overridden by so many of the other animations of the puppets, but that's just a guess really. But if you delete the signal manipulators, the arm will get stuck after standing in front of a wall for a while, so I guess they're useful for something. But well, that's it. If you watched this video completely through, props to you, and I hope this video helped in any way. If you're completely new to logic, I might have even gone a bit too quick, but remember that you can always come back in the future after you've experimented a bit and feel more comfortable with all the logic stuff. Like I said at the beginning of the video, I will probably make another one on first-person characters, but next time it will be a bit more practical. I just really wanted to get all this stuff out of the way, so I don't have to spend half the video explaining how the puppet works. Next time I'll just be able to refer to this video anytime I want, which is great. For now though, I hope you learned something today. I thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you around.